Thank you so much, Noelia. And I wanted to thank Noelia and her wonderful group who's been organizing this conference, and obviously to the Prado Museum for hosting this wonderful event. So in 2013, I listened to another keynote from Mary Wiesner-Hanks at the Gender and Political Culture Conference at Plymouth University, and it changed the course of my research. Professor Wiesner-Hanks urged us to think about the topic of our research in a global sense. This provoked me to shift the lens that I viewed queenship in. Scholars in the field of queenship studies have produced amazing work on European queens and queenship, from studies of individuals to dynastic and thematic groupings. Yet we were lacking works on royal women outside the European sphere. Or more precisely, we were lacking work which drew together the experiences of royal women and the practices of queenship in a truly global context. I wanted to break down these silos and how we were looking at queenship, as well as the sometimes artificial barriers that periodization can put in place. This led me to edit a companion to global queenship, bringing together a wonderful group of contributors who brought together research on women in various corners of the globe, from 8th century China to 19th century New Zealand. Their work not only looked at individual figures or women in a particular realm or region, but they offered comparative studies that brought together royal and court women from Europe, Asia, and Africa together in direct dialogue. Working on this collection encouraged me to write my own work, Queens and Queenship, in a comparative vein, looking at queenship across time, place, and cultures. In this work, I not only highlighted differences and divergence, but most importantly, emphasized connections and constants in the situation of royal women. I framed this work around 3 core themes that lay at the heart of queenship: family, rule, and image. It's this last theme, image, that I will focus on today, as it speaks directly to the focus of this wonderful event that we are attending here at the Prado. For a queen, image was everything. As the most visible woman in the realm, even if she was cloistered or behind a screen, her presence was felt and known throughout the realm. Her ability to craft a positive image was not only crucial for her own reputation, but for the effective functioning of the monarchy as a whole. If her image crafting was successful, it would serve her well not only in life, but in the afterlife and beyond, creating a positive legacy which would endure for centuries or even millennia as a historical halo, if you will. If she got it wrong, it could have a catastrophic impact which could lead to the loss of her position or the downfall of the monarchy itself, as well as a black legend that could persist in popular memory and culture, like Wu Zetian, Catherine de' Medici, we've already mentioned a few times today, and Maria Antoinette. Image fashioning spoke directly to the ideals of queenship, creating a virtuous circle or a feedback loop as queens sought to create an image that reflected these ideals. By creating an image that reflected contemporary understandings of queenly virtues, she simultaneously reinforced these ideals and created a model for future queens to follow and emulate. However, if her image jarred with these ideals of queenly behavior, she could become an example of an anti-worthy whose life would become a salutary lesson for other royal women in what not to do. One of the major findings of my research on global queenship is that we can see a great synergy between expectations of queens and royal women across time, place, culture, and religion. As women at the top of the social structure, there was a strong expectation that they should act as exemplars to all other women, behaving in ways which modeled ideals of female behavior. As William Caxton noted in The Game and Play of Chess, quote, "She is above all others in estate and reverence, so she should be an example to all others." As a quick but hopefully memorable summary, I've categorized these virtues into the 4 perfects and the 3 Ps. Women were meant to be the perfect woman, to be demure and humble, even if she was the most exalted woman in the realm. She should be the perfect wife, whether she was the king's only wife in the Christian monogamous European sense, or one of many wives, consorts, or concubines in a polygamous court framework. Being the perfect wife meant being chaste in terms of being sexually faithful to her husband to ensure the purity of the royal line. While she should be unquestionably faithful to her husband, part of being the perfect wife was being an understanding spouse and not being jealous of other women who caught his eye. This was vital in a polygamous court, where rivalry within the inner palace, the harem, or the zanana could cause dangerous, even deadly discord. A queen should be the perfect mother. Fertility was a key aspect of her role, providing heirs, which were crucial for dynastic monarchies to endure. While hands-on parenting wasn't necessarily expected for royal women, they still needed to be perfect mothers in terms of directing their child's education and upbringing and providing maternal guidance. The final perfect element is one that does apply more to queens than expectations of other women more broadly in society. They, like their spouses, were meant to have the attributes of good rulership. They were expected to be wise and just as co-rulers with their husbands or sons, as well as in administration, whether that was in their own domains, their dower lands, or like the valide sultans of the Ottoman Empire that we've just been hearing about, running the Enderun, or the inner court. Being wise and just also links to the first of the 3 Ps, being a peacemaker. Women were seen in both Eastern and Western societies as being a counterpart or balance to men. Just as men were viewed as being aggressive and martial, women were expected to be a calming influence who brought peace. This expectation gave royal women an entrée to diplomacy, to intercede with their husbands, to urge mercy and clemency, to negotiate to resolve disputes, as in the famous Peace of the Ladies in 1529, and to be involved in matrimonial diplomacy, combining being the perfect mother with attempts to build a lasting peace through dynastic alliances. No matter which religion they adhered to, a royal woman was expected to be a model of piety in word and deed. Even women who could not be seen in public and made her devotions within a semi-private court sphere could publicly display their piety through the patronage of religious sites that could bear their name or statue as a foundress or become a location for their tomb. Finally, royal women were expected to be conventionally pretty. Even traditional fairy tales express the notion that a princess should be, quote, the fairest lady in the land, end quote. Queens were often idealized and represented as beauties in portraits, even if that wasn't a realistic depiction of their looks. Beautiful or not, they were expected to reflect or even set the trends for what was considered conventional beauty and fashion for women in their society. This paper will discuss how royal women developed and projected an image which resonated with these queenly virtues by openly displaying them through acts of patronage, performing rituals and ceremony, and visual image crafting through dress, display, and portraiture. We will examine how royal women had to strike a careful balance in terms of projecting shock and awe in their personal majesty and power, as well as that of the realm, with the expectation that they should also be modest and humble. We will begin with display in terms of both attire and jewelry before moving to the importance of ritual and ceremonial in terms of both major life cycle events and the performance of court daily events. We'll then look at portraiture as a pivot point between dress and display and cultural patronage as a powerful form of visual image crafting. Finally, we'll round off with a brief consideration of patronage to reconnect with the wider themes of the symposium. My aim here is to provide context so we can see how patronage fits into the wider schema of queenly image construction and to contextualize the situation of European women who are the focus of the symposium with their global counterparts. Display is a vital element of image creation, which can take many forms in terms of a royal woman's dress and adornment. Display is a crucial means of demonstrating majesty and affirming her elevated status, wealth, power, and authority, as seen by the recent collection by Aaron Griffey, Sartorial Politics in Early Modern Europe. Several of the essays in this collection highlight how royal women in Italy, France, Spain, England, and Sweden used both clothing and jewelry to project majesty as well as affirm their position, sovereignty, and dynastic identity. However, it was crucial to get the balance right in creating a sense of awe in the observer and adhering to expectations of queenly modesty and decorum. Pushing the richness of display too far could lead to criticism of a queen being spendthrift or obsessed with luxury and the superficiality of appearance. An example of that at the end of the early modern period is Maria Antoinette, who was lampooned for her increasingly elaborate wigs and plethora of new dresses commissioned each season from her couturière Rose Bertin, which featured in her portraits by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. Dress could be a powerful tool for queens to assert their personal and national identity. For example, Eleanor of Austria, Queen of France, and Eleonora de Toledo, Duchess of Florence, both, quote, gave clear messages of imperial allegiance by wearing Spanish attire in their adopted countries long after their marriages, end quote. However, the strategy could also backfire on queens by amplifying their status as a foreigner or an outsider with questionable loyalties. The Spanish princess Maria Teresa and her retinue were mocked by French observers for their guarda infanta, or farthingales, that they wore during the ceremonial held to celebrate her impending marriage to Louis XIV. To avoid this kind of appropriation, royal women could be pressured to adopt the dress of their marital courts. For example, the French princess Isabella of Bourbon was sent a dress in the Spanish fashion by the Habsburg Archduchess Isabella Clara Eugenia in 1612 to demonstrate how she should dress as Philip III's queen. On the slides, you have an excerpt of a letter from Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII of England, that she sent to Margaret of Austria, the aunt of her then-betrothed future Charles V, to thank her for the information that she sent on fashions of the Burgundian court. I won't read the whole quote out because it's quite long, but effectively she's thanking her for helping her be aware of what she should expect to wear and what the fashions were in the Burgundian court. The adornment of the queen's body was a vital means of projecting her status as queen and the authority that came from her tenure of the queen's office. Indeed, many fabrics, such as cloth of gold or those dyed with Tyrian purple, were reserved by law for members of the royal family only, meaning that anyone who viewed the queen wearing garments made of these materials would be instantly reminded of her exalted rank. As Michelle Beer has demonstrated with the example of Margaret Tudor, Mary's sister, clothing could be particularly important for reinforcing queenly status. This was particularly vital when her rank was in transition at the beginning or end of her time as consort, or when it was under threat, such as when Margaret lost the Scottish regency and was living in exile in England. During this period, Margaret's brother Henry VIII continued to fund her expensive apparel to assuage his personal and dynastic honor, as well as emphasize her status as Queen of Scots in order to reassert her right to the regency that Henry wanted her to reclaim and use for England's political benefit. Thus, wearing costly fabrics not only demonstrated a queen's own wealth, but it was also a means of projecting her husband's, her family's, or even the entire realm's financial health, power, and glory. Jewelry was another form of adornment and display that was deeply linked to the Queen's royal position. In her study of the jewel collection of the Queens of England, Nicola Tallis demonstrated how queens not only projected their status through the jewels they wore, but how they used jewels to reinforce their position by gifting them across their courtly and international networks, which helped develop their network's strength and reach. Jewels could be used to signal allegiance to natal dynasties, such as the brooches that Anna of Denmark wore with the initials of her brother Christian IV of Denmark, or as markers of confessional identity, like the rosary beads pictured at the waist of Mary, Queen of Scots. Queens also received jewels as gifts and markers of key moments in their life cycle, such as their wedding, coronation, and the birth of heirs. These key ceremonial events were also occasions for wearing the crown jewels or regalia, key symbols of monarchical power that were imbued with great significance due to their historical importance and their place in ritual. As well as jewels, the clothing that queens wore for ritual and ceremonial was imbued with deep cultural significance and formed yet another element of display. The queens of Chosun Korea are an excellent example with very specific attire that was worn for different ceremonies, and as Shin Ming-ho notes, quote, each color and motif carried profound meaning, end quote. The Chosun queens largely followed the model of the Chinese rites of Zhou, which stipulated which type of robe, headdress, and colors were appropriate for each type of ritual and ceremonial. Her most important ceremonial robe was the pheasant robe, which was worn for major rituals and occasions. The pheasants themselves were highly symbolic and reflected both Confucian and queenly ideals. Its 5 colors represented the 5 virtues of benevolence, justice, courtesy, integrity, and wisdom, as well as the 5 directions and the 5 elements. In this way, when the queen wore the robe, she was displaying her status and reinforcing these shared cultural values both to her subjects and to herself, as, quote, the pheasants on the royal robe were to remind the queen to remain a virtuous woman, end quote. Pheasants, dragons, and other symbolic decoration could be also found on the hairpins or beignets, which were used to hold the elaborate court hairstyles in place. These pieces of jewelry could be fashioned from a range of materials, including gold and green or white jade, and could be ornamented with precious stones. The size, design, materials, and adornment of these hairpins were also indicators of a royal woman's rank. Thus, we can see how Chosun royal women used attire and adornment to visually communicate her elevated status, and by bringing together display and ceremony, were able to powerfully connect with societal values and queenly ideals. Ritual and ceremonial were activities which underpinned the practice of queenship, the daily rhythm of court life, and even the functioning of monarchy itself. Indeed, in many cultures, rituals conducted by queens and other royal figures were believed to have an essential role in maintaining harmony between the divine and humanity, and ensuring adequate rainfall and good harvests. Thus, if royal women did not perform these rituals or failed to do them correctly, there could be a potentially disastrous impact on the lives of their subjects. Ritual and ceremonial take many different forms, from those that follow a predictable cycle, from daily ritual to annual observances, to those which are infrequent, irregular, or even extraordinary. This ranged from daily routines, such as religious services and devotions, and rituals connected to rising, going to bed, and dining. These daily ritual activities affirmed rank and court protocol and the queen's position as the leader of her household and the preeminent woman at court. She was either the leader or focus of these ritual activities. Indeed, a key part of queenly participation in ritual was connected to the religious underpinning of courtly ceremonial, from daily religious observances to the key religious festivals and holy days. It was an opportunity for the queen to engage in performative piety as an exemplar of behavior to her subjects. Other court rituals, which could take place regularly or on an infrequent basis, were connected to distinctive practices and values. One of the most important elements of ceremonial for Korean queens was the annual sericulture ceremony, where the queen enacted a symbolic representation of all women's work. This important ceremony, which took place each spring, involved the queen and her entourage of elite women making an offering to Sanjam, the goddess of silkworms, ritually plucking a mulberry tree, and then participating in a series of banquets. Rain-making rituals, or ceremonial to ensure a good harvest, were also key rituals in many countries, as part of the role of the monarchy to act as a mediator between their subjects and the divine. For example, in 1448, the complete Chronicle of Da Viet recorded the participation of the king and queen mother in what is now Vietnam in a ritual which included prayers, offerings, and the chanting of Buddhist monks in an attempt to assuage a drought in 1448. In Africa, there are several examples of monarchies that have strong traditions regarding the powers of kings and queens who have the power to bring rain through their personal magic and the performance of ritual, such as the Rain Queen of the Love Dew. Major life cycle events in a queen's life are often tied to important ceremonial events, tracing the trajectory of their lives from baptism, betrothal and wedding, coronation, childbirth-related ceremonial, and funerals. The first royal ceremonial which a royal woman participated in were often those performed for her own birth. While she was the focus of these events, she could clearly not be a fully engaged participant. Due to the significance of a royal woman's marriage in building dynastic alliances and establishing her own position, there is considerable ceremonial at this point, which is a key transitional moment from the initial betrothal or selection through to the marriage itself. A princess might be betrothed several times over her youth and thus take part in a number of ceremonies, and her wedding may have multiple ceremonial stages. In pre-modern Europe, there was often a proxy wedding first, in which representatives for the bride and/or groom took part in a ritual that was more binding than a mere betrothal, to give more security to both parties that the union would go ahead. Yet it was consummation which was vital to validate the marriage. So some proxy ceremonies had a mock bedding element where the stand-ins for the bride and groom would lie next to each other in a bed and touch their legs briefly together, or even just sit next to each other in bed to satisfy the idea that the marriage had been consummated. Chosun Korea offers an incredibly elaborate series of ceremonial for royal weddings, which had to be followed in a strict sequence and according to detailed protocol for the union to be considered to be valid. The bride was selected after an extensive screening process. Once that decision was made, there was a 10-step process of rituals that had to be completed before she was properly wed. Rather than a ritual which focused on uniting the royal couple, the key moment in the process was effectively her coronation or her investiture in her new office. This important ceremony was held at a special bridal pavilion, where she was given her official document of investiture, her seal of office, and her mandate robes. The induction ritual followed, where the queen was escorted into the palace by a sizable procession of courtiers, officials, and royal family members. The consummation ritual took place on the queen's first night at the palace, if she and the groom were of suitable age. This completed the major ceremonies, but yet more rituals followed for the new bride to present her formally to the royal family, to the court, to the officials, and the wives of the major clans of the realm. For Christian queens, their actual wedding ceremony invariably included a religious element, whether the ceremonial was performed in front of or within a church. Some form of blessing took place from a prelate to recognize and validate the couple's union. As noted previously, however, consummation was considered to be a vital element to establish the marriage as fully legitimate and legally binding. In Africa, however, other tests and types of rituals were used to affirm the validity of a royal union. In what is now South Sudan, the Lulubo kings and their wives were placed together in a small hut where an ebony fire was burning. As the smoke from fires lit from ebony wood are particularly acid, it was a key test to see if one of them reacted badly to the fumes by sneezing. If they did so, it was believed to be an indication that they were unfit for the royal position, or that the, quote, the office does not like them, end quote. If they did withstand the smoke, then the ceremonial to affirm the union was completed with the sacrifice of purification. The queen would then assume her office by taking up her duties, and her bride wealth would be paid. For many royal women, their wedding was connected with a ceremony of installation or coronation, particularly if their husband was already king. However, it must be noted that not all consorts had a formal ceremony to recognize their ascension to the queen's office. Coronation rituals could be replaced by other ceremonies like bridal entries, like those for Isabella de Valois' series of ceremonial entries to Spanish cities, including Pamplona, Guadalajara, Alcalá, and Madrid in 1559. For consorts, it was not necessarily a requirement that they undergo a coronation, investiture, or installation, but their position was certainly enhanced by the formal recognition of their status through these important rituals. However, regnant queens or proprietary queens were required to have some kind of ceremonial to mark the beginning of their reign, which varied according to the monarchical traditions of the realm. Often these traditions, which had been designed with a male sovereign in mind, would have to be modified to accommodate a female ruler. This could be even more complicated if the queen was married, as the coronation ceremonies would have to be adjusted to include a king consort as well. Consort queens could also share a coronation with their husbands, particularly if she had been married to the heir. So a queen consort might share in the ceremonial for her husband's elevation to the throne. The queen could play a prominent role in their joint installation. For example, in Southeast Asia, a Khmer chronicle recounts a joint coronation from the 17th century, where the queen was responsible for placing not just the scroll with her own title, but also the one bearing her husband's title onto a ceremonial tray, which confirmed their position as the new rulers. African monarchies show many different scenarios for coronation rituals, many of which featured both king and his chief wife or a female relative whom he reigned jointly with. For example, in Buganda in East Africa, the king and his queen sister, or Labuga, were installed jointly, being carried together to a sacred height at Budo Hill, and both participated equally in the ceremony, taking oaths to, quote, protect the country and rule well, end quote. In many polygamous courts, queen mothers could be the most powerful and exalted woman in the realm, and thus she could be the one to share a coronation ceremony with a new king, as is the case in Swazi coronation rituals. Another major focus for ritual and ceremony in the life cycle of a queen was connected to childbirth. Effectively, the process of queenly childbirth and the attendant ceremonial can be broken down into several key stages: preparation for the birth itself, and finally postpartum and purification. Across various cultures, there appears to be a shared desire for queens to give birth in a designated space that was ritually prepared for this important event. This could be tied to a particular location which had meaning. For example, the first Tudor king, Henry VII of England, was keen for his wife Elizabeth of York to give birth to their son and heir at Winchester. This location was vital to the symbolic establishment of the new Tudor dynasty. Winchester's long tradition of hosting important royal ceremonies gave the new dynasty a sense of continuity by connecting with their dynastic predecessors. This link with the past was further reinforced by naming the child Arthur, which harked back to a legendary king. Arthur's baptism at Winchester Cathedral featured a host of royal women who played important roles in the ceremonies. Elizabeth's sister Anne bore the chrism cloth, and her sister Cecily carried Arthur to the font, while their mother, the former Queen Elizabeth Woodville, was the prince's godmother. Given the significance of the potential outcome of the birth, the production of a future monarch, once the queen went into labor, many attendants and observers might be called, from religious personnel charged with performing important rituals to courtiers and officials who needed to be on hand to witness and verify the birth. At the Chosun court, once the queen's pregnancy was confirmed, a special delivery office was set up with doctors, midwives, and officials whose role was to monitor the baby and the mother and to prepare for the birth itself, as well as carry out all of the related ceremonial. However, while dozens, from servants to politicians, courtiers, and royal family members, witnessed Mary of Modena give birth to a son in London in 1688, the contradictory accounts of observers who were deposed by the council could not conclusively refute the rumors that the child had been smuggled in a warming pan. The idea of childbirth as a polluting process also appears to be common to most cultures, and many rituals during the process of pregnancy, labor, and postpartum were designed to prevent or remove pollution or protect its spread. On the 7th day after the birth in Korea, a special remove the straw ceremony was performed, which involved the ritual removal and storage of the birthing bed and sacrifice with offerings of silk, silver, and rice, along with special rituals to clean and store the umbilical cord and placenta in a special urn. At this point, if mother and baby were well and the rituals had all been performed, the delivery office for the royal birth was considered closed. For Christian queens, a model for this ritual was drawn from the life of the Virgin Mary. The Feast of Candlemas, held 40 days after the birth of Christ, is also a celebration for the purification of the Virgin. Thus, the lying-in period or pre-churching period for some queens followed this same pattern of 40 days. However, many queens did not survive the process of childbirth or died shortly thereafter from complications or infections, including two of Philip II's wives, Maria Manuela of Portugal and Isabella de Valois, as well as the Mughal Empress Mumtaz Mahal, whose death triggered the construction of the famous Taj Mahal. The death of queens triggered the last ceremony performed in their honor, their funeral. However, this ceremony, like the rituals surrounding the birth of a royal woman, was one that they were the focus of rather than a participant in. While many queens went to great lengths to stipulate how these rituals should be performed, where they wanted to be buried, and the design of the tomb where they would rest, they had no ability to ensure that this was actioned after their death. Yet their tomb, if constructed in their lifetime, could serve as the final element of image creation, which, if the tomb and building survived unaltered, could resonate and reinforce ideals of queenship and serve as an enduring monument to their memory. A perfect example of this is the tomb of Maperi Khatun, a 13th century wife and mother of Seljuk sultans at Kayseri in now modern Turkey, which is shown on the slides, and I'll read this out really quickly, as a list of queenly virtues. This is the tomb of the lady, the veiled, the fortunate, the happy, the martyr, the ascetic, the obedient, the fighter, the promoter of the faith, the chaste, the just, queen of the woman in the world, the virtuous and clean, the Mary of her age, the Khadijah of her time, possessor of knowledge, almsgiver of wealth in thousands, purity of the world and religion. Portraits were perhaps the ultimate tool for self-fashioning and image creation, bringing together elements of display and patronage in a powerful visual form. Portraits of royal women speak to the ideals of queenship discussed earlier, which were so central to image creation, with visual clues that alluded to her role as the perfect wife or mother, or her piety, as well as reflecting contemporary notions of beauty or prettiness, the last of our 3 Ps. The Prado's collection is replete with important portraits of the women of the House of Habsburg or Austria, as highlighted in the Prado and Femenino tour, which we'll be discussing at length at this symposium. Portraits can carry political messages that bolster a queen's position, whether she was a regnant queen like Christina of Sweden or a regent like Maria Anna of Austria, both of whom we'll discuss tomorrow. Another contemporary queen regent in the 17th century, Mary de' Medici, commissioned a slide of 24 paintings which trace her rise from an Italian princess to the consort of Henri IV and then regent for Louis XIII from the renowned artist Peter Paul Rubens. These paintings, designed to hang in the palace she built as her new residence in Paris, now the Palais de Luxembourg, quote, can be understood as a display of magnificence aimed at adding to the queen's power, as well as a form of persuasion aimed at promoting her views, end quote, as Sarah Galetti has noted. They can be seen, perhaps, as an unusual form of portraiture, as the queen herself features in the cycle from infant to regent. There's even a painting, which you can see here, of Henri IV receiving a portrait of Marie as a potential bride. Indeed, paintings of potential brides were a common focus of European portraiture. Famous examples include Hen Holbein's portraits, which you can see here, of Christina of Denmark and Anne of Cleves as potential brides for Henry VIII of England after the death of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, in childbirth. Yet portraits had a much wider currency in early modern Europe. For example, they could be exchanged as diplomatic gifts, or they could mark key life cycle moments for a royal woman, such as her marriage, coronation, or the birth of an heir. Beyond Europe, portraits of royal women could be created and used in very different ways, and I'm going to give some examples from Asia and Africa to demonstrate. While it can be difficult for modern viewers of portraits to grasp when they interact with a painting in a museum, or increasingly online, the placement of a portrait was vital to understand its audience, impact, and intended use. For example, was a miniature portrait designed to be worn on the body? Was the painting hung in a palace? And if so, where was it placed? And who had access to this space to view the portrait? In early modern Asia, specifically in Ming and Qing China and Chosun Korea, portrait halls were created to house representations of emperors and kings, as well as their wives and mothers, keeping in mind that in polygamous courts, it's often a dowager queen or empress or queen mother who was the most powerful woman at court. These portrait halls were very different than the galleries in European palaces, such as the Première Chambre of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Low Countries for Emperor Charles V, at her palace at Mechlin, where 30 of her collection of nearly 100 portraits were displayed, which demonstrated her familial and political connections across Europe to courtiers and visitors. In contrast, royal or imperial portrait halls in China and Korea had a very select dynastic audience and a very different purpose. The Hall of Imperial Longevity in Qing, China, was designed to house a series of portraits for the imperial family to visit in order to honor their ancestors. The portraits in the Hall of Imperial Longevity were particularly created and selected, with the royal women featured based on the personal preference of particular emperors, reflecting, quote, the empress's role and influence in the Qing imperial family and dynastic history, end quote. The portraits were life-size and deliberately designed to be as lifelike as possible in order to be effective vehicles for ancestor veneration. The portrayal of the empresses give us a window into the contemporary ideals of beauty and display, as they are all dressed in formal court attire, with impressive jewelry which denotes their wealth, power, and rank. Like their Korean counterparts discussed earlier, their robes and jewelry were replete with symbols. The portraits that you see here of Empress Dowager Zhao Zhuang and Empress Zhao Zian are both shown wearing a hat with 7 gold phoenixes, quote, the mythical bird that symbolized the power of the empress, end quote, as well as 3 pearl earrings in each ear that signified her exalted status. Chosun Korea built on these traditions from the Chinese and their Goryeo predecessors to create portrait halls, origin shrines, and portrait repositories, which all helped with the veneration and even consultation of ancestors and predecessors through their portraits. Unfortunately for us as historians, in 1954, a fire in a storage facility destroyed many of the Chosun royal portraits. But court records clearly established the importance of portraits of royal women and the role that Korean queens played in ritual venerators and as venerated figures themselves. Indeed, the first Chosun origin shrine, Munsojeon, or Hall of Civil Brightness, began in 1398 as a portrait hall for Sinui, the first consort of King Taiho. Portraits of consorts, queens, and dowagers were commissioned and venerated in rituals alongside Chosun kings. Chosun royal women also played a key role in ritual observances, and praise was given to them by biographers for their diligence, quote, in the handlings of the ritual foods and vessels from preparation to presentation, end quote. Thus, queens were both venerators, and their queenly portraits were later venerated by women who followed them, as well as their male descendants. This highlights a connection between portraiture, rituals, and ideals of behavior. By demonstrating due diligence and ritual veneration of the portraits of their predecessors and deceased relatives, Chosun queens were both connecting with queenly ideals of piety, as well as Korean ideals of feminine behavior, given the expectation that primary wives would oversee preparations for all offerings to serve the ancestors. Just as they often acted as intermediaries in matters of succession, dowager queens were also involved in decisions regarding the development of portrait halls and what was hung inside them. For example, in 1469, Queen Dowager Jeonghui ordered her son King Yejong to build a portrait hall near the tomb of his father, while in 1802, Queen Dowager Yeongsun ordered that the portrait of her husband, the late King Yeongjo, be replaced with a later portrait because she felt it was a more accurate and lifelike portrayal of the monarch. In this way, Chosun queens were not only crafting their own image through portraiture, they were crafting the image of the dynasty for generations to come. Through these Asian examples, we've seen how portraiture can be a powerful method of image crafting, which can reinforce queenly ideals through the beauty and display in the portraits themselves, the curation of dynastic portrait halls and collections, and ritual observances connected to the veneration of their predecessors' portraits. While the first 2 elements resonate with the experience of their European counterparts, who also commissioned lifelike portraits to craft their image and curated collections of dynastic portraits, the ritual element of ancestor veneration is what sets these Asian examples apart. In Africa, too, we see portraiture being a means of connecting with and reverencing ancestors of the past. Bronze statues were created both of kings, or Oba, and queen mothers, Ioba, of the West African kingdom of Benin. These sculpted portraits were placed on altars where they acted as, quote, narrative vessels through which the ancestors of the Edo tribe are remembered, end quote. As in many monarchies with a polygamous court framework in Africa and across the globe, it is the king's mother who is the most important and high-ranking woman in the Benin court. Because of her prominence and significance, as Flora Kaplan has noted, quote, from the 1500s on, virtually all court art created for royal women focuses on the Ioba, end quote. While all of the Oba's wives were expected to demonstrate wider expectations of wifely behavior and reflect societal notions of beauty, it is the Ioba who, quote, is the quintessential woman in Benin, embodying the virtues and accomplishments desired amongst women generally in society, end quote. And yet, she represents even more than that. As the supreme woman of the land, quote, the Ioba embodies the possibilities for women to acquire wealth, prestige, influence, and even immortality, end quote. Thus, like her European counterparts, the Ioba was placed on a virtual pedestal as a powerful woman to admire and emulate, And representations of her, in turn, both reflect and pass on queenly ideals and expectations of ideal feminine behavior to successive generations. These bronze sculptures have great importance both in the past and even as the present, as the focus of modern controversies over recent requests to turn these precious artifacts back to their country of origin. Kaplan explains the significance of these items. Quote, "Queen Mother heads have multi-layered symbolism. The head itself has many meanings for Benin's. The serenity of the features, the facial marks, the headdress, and the many related motifs all implode on ancient history. Ornaments and insignia of rank, indeed the materials themselves, draw added meaning from being identified with maleness and are bestowed on the basis of gender roles and rank." So both examples that you have on the slide feature the distinctive conical headdress of the Yoruba, known as the ukope oke, or parrot's beak. This headdress is covered by a lattice of coral beads. Coral was an indicator of wealth and high rank. The distinctive coral shirt that the Yoruba is often depicted as wearing could only be worn by herself or the Izomo, the war chief. The Yoruba is also depicted with distinctive markings on her forehead, and the representations of Idia, the first Yoruba, feature two deep markings in the center. According to tradition, Idia's parents sought to discourage the Yoruba's attention to their daughter by asking a doctor to make incisions on her forehead to make her less attractive, and to place medicines in those incisions that would repel the king. However, the Oba had his own doctors treat her, and she eventually bore him a son who became Oba Isegi, a powerful king who raised his mother up and made her the first Ioba. These incisions can be seen in the ivory pendant mask you have here of Idia, one of the many surviving depictions of this important queen mother. In contrast with the bronze images of the queen's mothers, as discussed earlier, the ivory material this mask was fashioned from connected with ideas of ritual purity and to Olokun, the god of the sea. This piece of portraiture was designed with a very different use in mind. Unlike the bronze sculptures that were placed on altars, these were small pieces designed to be worn on the belt of the Oba. While European queens also featured in miniature portraits that could be worn by kings and relatives, these were worn as one of a collection of pendant plaques with symbolic meaning on the Oba's waist during the annual Igwe and Emobo ceremonies. The pendant plaques were considered to act as a kind of charm. One example in the Seattle Art Museum even contained a secret compartment behind the plaque with protective medicines for the Oba's use. We've seen how portraiture in these global contexts reinforce queenly and womanly ideals and ideas of display, and symbols of power and authority that reinforce her position as the premier woman of the realm, and as important dynastic progenitors, just as it did for European counterparts. However, what sets portraiture apart in these Asian and African examples is their ritual usage as a focus for ceremonial veneration on ancestral altars and in royal portrait halls, as well as being worn in and used in ceremonies by rulers. This brings together ideas of ceremonial as an element of image crafting, as these queens, empresses, and Iobas played a key role in ceremonies that venerated their predecessors as a key part of the function of their office. And they also became the focus of veneration for their successors and descendants for centuries to come. In this last section, I will keep brief, as patronage is the focus of most of the papers of the symposium, and this will be well covered by my colleagues. It's important to note that patronage could take many forms. Here at the symposium, we are considering largely cultural patronage, but there is the sponsorship of artists, artisans, and architects to create works of art in royal residences, as well as curating these spaces with furnishings and collections of objects with both symbolics and practical uses. Yet there are other forms of patronage. One is political patronage, which was vital for royal women to use in building networks or affinities at court and beyond. Another is educational patronage. Royal women were not only highly educated themselves, like Elizabeth I of England, they were also keenly involved in the education of their children, as a recent symposium in London on the 500th anniversary of Juan Luis Vives demonstrates. This event was sponsored by the Arte Poder Género Research Group, and it highlighted the key role that Isabella Católica and Catherine of Aragon played in directing the education of their children. Indeed, Catherine of Aragon's desire to provide an education worthy of an heiress for her daughter, Mary I, led her to commission Vives to write his famous tract on female education. Educational patronage could be linked to architectural patronage. As we've been hearing in the previous keynote, several Ottoman valide sultans in the early modern period, such as Nurbanu, Korsem, and Turhan Sultan, constructed mosque complexes that included a range of facilities for the local communities, including libraries, colleges, and schools. For example, the Yeni Mosque complex in Istanbul, begun by Turhan Sultan, contained a primary school which offered free education as well as clothing for all of its students. Religious patronage could easily cross over with artistic and architectural patronage. Professor Noelia Garcia Perez's edited collection on Juana of Austria highlights the development of the Monastery of Descalces Reales here in Madrid. That became an important center for royal women in Spain and is a perfect example of the multifaceted dimension and long-term impact of religious patronage. While patronage has been rightly explored as one of the key aspects of queenship, or the exercise of the Queen's office, an area that's only recently been getting attention from queenship scholars is the examination of the finances of royal women. The economic aspect of queenship is vital. It underpins much of the Queen's activities, particularly where patronage is concerned. We've demonstrated how queens spent their money to some degree, at least in terms of how it's been allocated to patronage and gift-giving, but little attention thus far has been given to the means by which queens obtained, maintained, and managed their finances, something that the Examining the Resources and Revenues of Royal Women in Pre-Modern Europe, or the Queen's Resources Project, is working to illuminate. By doing so, we can bring that missing economic piece of the puzzle into this wider understanding of how queens use display, ceremonial, portraiture, and patronage to craft their image. As this paper's highlighted, these were all important tools for royal women to craft an image that would resonate with the queenly ideals and the expectations of their subjects. We've seen how display in the form of queenly dress and jewelry to project majesty and use symbolic allusions to draw links to natal and marital dynasties, as well as reinforce ideals of queenship. Ritual and ceremonial have been highlighted as a key means for royal women to reinforce their position. We saw this both in major life cycle ceremonies, such as their weddings and coronations, which established their status, as well as through daily or annual observances, which allowed them to demonstrate performative piety or fulfill their role as the exemplar of the perfect woman, wife, and mother. Portraiture can be seen as a powerful tool for image crafting, which combined elements of display and patronage. And in the case of the global examples offered here, contain key ceremonial uses as well. Finally, we've ended with patronage, the focus of the symposium. We reflected on the many different dimensions of patronage which were available to royal women: cultural, educational, political, and religious, and how these could be helpfully combined in major projects that could provide a long-lasting legacy for a queen. Taken together, this paper has demonstrated the link between image, ideals, and the practice of queenship. Queens and royal women were conscious of the expectations of their spouses, peers, courtiers, and subjects of their behavior. Held up as the preeminent woman of the realm and the exemplar to all others, it was vital that she crafted an image that resonated with the expectations that she was the perfect woman, wife, mother, and ruler, and that she reflected societal ideals of beauty and piety, as well as being a promoter of peace within the court, realm, and between nations. Through the effective practice of queenship, her actions, using the tools of display, ceremonial, portraiture, and patronage, enabled her to craft an image. If the queen was successful in this task, she would not only ensure her popularity with her subjects in her lifetime, but could both reinforce the monarchy and create an enduring personal legacy as a great and beloved queen, held up for generations to follow as the model to emulate and becoming an ancestor to be venerated by her successors. Thank you.